All right. Okay. We left off last time with Nixon and Watergate. When Nixon had to resign, Gerald Ford took over. Gerald Ford's administration was brief, only lasted a couple of years, actually about a year and a half. And he became unpopular partly because of the economy, inflation. Inflation was really bad during his administration. As was the case under Jimmy Carter. Now, your book says that the high inflation was brought about by increased oil prices. I think a lot of it had to do with Richard Nixon taking us off the gold standard, but then again, that's just my take on it. But anyway, about the crisis that they faced, both Ford and Carter, about the crisis they faced, it was brought on in part by a Mideast war called the Yom Kippur War. Egypt and Syria and Jordan invaded Israel while Israel was celebrating Yom Kippur. And then the war lasted 3 weeks. But during that time, about the time Israel got its veteran troops in and started winning, Egypt and Syria and Jordan sued for peace. But then the Middle Eastern nations got their heads together and said, we're going to control oil prices, we're going to raise oil prices. They couldn't do that today. But the meeting was called OPEC, oil producing exporting countries. You don't hear much about OPEC today, but in those days OPEC started raising its prices, and this was designed to hurt the Western world, and it brought about inflation. Now, folks, for many years, gasoline prices went from 28 to 32 cents a gallon, 28 to 32. When OPEC started raising their prices, gasoline went to 40 cents a gallon, then 45, then 50. And we experienced long lines to gas pumps. I mean, you might sit an hour and a half and just slowly and gradually move up. You could sit there and listen to the radio and read a book while you moved your car forward to finally get some gasoline. But there were long lines to gas pumps because there were a fuel shortage. My dad called it the supposed fuel shortage, and I have to say he turned out to be right. But we were dependent on foreign oil at the time. Now today, as I hope you all know, we are not dependent on foreign oil anymore. We have enough oil to supply ourselves and our friends too. And this has somewhat forced the price of oil down, and OPEC is greatly divided anymore. They're no longer united. A recession resulted as a result of the OPEC crisis, and that was what did Ford in, a recession, and ultimately what did Jimmy Carter in also, inflation. Between recession and inflation. Now, Jimmy Carter is a Georgian, the oldest president to live. I mean, he's lived longer than any other president we've ever had. And I've been to he has his presidential library right here in Atlanta. I've been there a couple of times. And I've been down the Plains, where I have not seen his home, but I've been to his hometown of Plains, Georgia. Here's my take on Jimmy Carter. He was elected by the Christian conservatives who turned around 4 years later and unelected him. The same people who elected him voted for a divorced Hollywood movie star 4 years later because he proved to be, we thought that being a Christian, he called himself a born-again Christian, a Southern Baptist Bible class teacher. We thought he'd be conservative, and he turned out to be the most liberal president we'd had up to that point. Anyway, Jimmy Carter did not last long in the White House, turned the people who elected him against him. Americans, the average American family they're what you call real wages. So what is real wages? A real wage or real money is the buying power of that money. In other words, back when the minimum wage was $1 an hour in 1960, and a lot of workers made about $40 a week, maybe $41 or $45 a week if they were lucky. But those dollars had more buying power than today's dollars. So a man, if he budgeted right, could live on $40 a week, $160 a month back then. A person today making $10 an hour is making less in real money than a person in 1960 made who was making $1 an hour. Now, real money is the actual buying power of the money. So real money, real wages went down during the time that Ford and Carter was president. Between 1973 and 1984, the family income dropped about 6%. Now, in November 1979, Iran took 53 American hostages and held them as prisoners in the American embassy. Now, folks, this is contrary to every international law, and for the first time, the Soviet Union and Red China sided with us that the hostages should be released. Iran held on to them for 400 and some days. The crisis began November 4th, 1979, and finally ended on the day Ronald Reagan became president. Jimmy Carter sent a fleet in once, sent some aircraft in to rescue the hostages, but one of the helicopters crashed and Carter's fleet of airplanes turned around and came back. Again, folk, our trouble with Iran goes back that far. 1979, 2019, the hostages were taken 40 years ago this upcoming November. 40 years. And we're still having trouble with Iran. Anyway, Jimmy Carter lost the election of 1980 pretty badly. Ronald Reagan became the president. All right. Ronald Reagan cut taxes, especially for the rich. I thought I'd written that down here. Anyway, he's remembered for cutting taxes, but at the same time he built up the nation's defenses. He ran an arms race with the Soviet Union, which the Soviet Union could not manage. Now also, in 1979, that was the year that the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan and got involved in an 8-year-long war which the Soviets could not win, just like we got bogged down in Vietnam. They got bogged down. And the Soviets could not win the war. Then Ronald Reagan built up her armaments and built them up bigger and bigger. The Soviet Union tried to keep up, but their economy could not keep up. So to make a long story short, by 1990, the Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse. Ronald Reagan somehow managed to rein in inflation. But, all right, now here's the catch-22. Didn't you hear me just say he cut taxes and increased military spending? How did he do it? Borrowing. Borrowed money and got the country deeper and deeper into debt. And this was a Republican now. Reagan was a Republican, supposedly. But now, Ronald Reagan also decreased spending for welfare programs. Sad news for a lot of people who are depending on government money for welfare. But eventually, the federal government was to get out of welfare. The President, Bill Clinton, turned over welfare to the states. Ronald Reagan curtailed labor unions along with his friend Margaret Thatcher in Great Britain. Reagan and Thatcher were close friends, and they both fought communism and socialism. Ronald Reagan had spent a lot of his life fighting communism. Well, after Reagan had served his 8 years, all right, I'll say this about Reagan. In the last year of his presidency, he started to develop Alzheimer's, but that was kept really, really quiet from the American people. But he started to develop Alzheimer's, and he revealed it after he got out of office. He eventually died from Alzheimer's. But Bush 41, I mean, there are two Bushes. George H.W. or George W. Anyway, two Bushes, father and son. Bush 41 took Ronald Reagan's place. He's remembered for two things: the Mideast War. During his watch, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait and took over Kuwait. Bush got together a coalition of nations who drove Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, and they believed that the Iraqi people would kill Saddam Hussein. They didn't. So it took another war to get rid of him. But anyways, Saddam Hussein was driven out of Kuwait, and then a slight recession occurred right about election year, and this destroyed Bush's presidency. There was a short economic downturn. Governor Bill Clinton, governor of Arkansas, took advantage of the downturn and was elected president in 1992. Now, Bill Clinton ran the country like a Republican more than like a Democrat. He ended federal government welfare and turned it over to the states. He balanced his budget twice, something that Nixon balanced his budget once, Bill Clinton twice. Now, one thing, folks, that really helped Bill Clinton's economy, in 1987 and again in 1997, I'll put this date down. Well, yeah. Japanese and Korean and Hong Kong markets, so the Far Eastern markets, were found to have cheated on their trading. And the people in Japan began putting their money, hiding their money under mattresses or burying it in jars and putting the money away. So, but the bad thing about putting your savings in a jar and burying it, or the bad thing about putting money in a mattress, is it does not accrue interest that way. But the people of these countries started investing in the United States instead of investing in their own country. To some extent, Korea, South Korea, that is, and Japan have not recovered fully from this scandal, cheating on in the stock market. So, but who benefited? Well, Bill Clinton benefited because when the Japanese and not China, but the Japanese and the Taiwanese and Koreans put their money in the American stock market, it made the American stock market go up and up and up, and that made Bill Clinton look really good, even though it wasn't altogether his skills. Clinton's terms, both of them were marked by prosperity, but if you look at their history, folk, most presidents who have been re-elected have had a terrible time in their second term. Bill Clinton was no exception. Bill Clinton's second term was marked by his affair with Monica Lewinsky. Monica Lewinsky was a White House intern whom he could have ordered out of the White House if he had wanted to. But instead, he had an affair with Monica Lewinsky. And Bill Clinton is going to be remembered more for these affairs. He had several of them. Linda Tripp, Paula Jones, Monica Lewinsky, and I can't even think of some of the other names, but a whole bunch of young women he had affairs with. And the people, American people, were aware of this before they elected him the first time. And anyway, the Clintons seemed to be able to get away with everything. Bill Clinton, well, we'll stop right here with Bill Clinton, like the book does, and come back later and talk more about the second Bush and the administration and whatever. But anyway, moving on, Canada. Canada, its economy goes up and down with the United States. When we have economic boom, Canada has a boom. When we have depression, Canada has depression. The United States and Canada and Mexico have entered into a free trade agreement, no tariffs. That's okay for the United States and Canada, but Mexico is a weak part of that whole thing. Mexico simply is not the equal to the United States and Canada economically. But, anyway, we entered a free trade agreement involved all three. Canada has a problem in the province of Quebec, and this goes all the way back to the French and Indian War. The province of Quebec is French-speaking. Most of Canadians are English, but as the Treaty of 1763, the people of Quebec were promised they would not have to learn English, and they never did. And in 1995, there was a vote. Quebec, by a very, very close margin, voted to remain part of Canada. So to this day, Quebec is still part of Canada by a close vote. And they still speak French, still mostly Roman Catholic. But most of the rest of Canada is English speaking and Protestant. All right. So much for Canada now. There's a saying that Canadians are just like us. That's partly true. Latin America. Latin American nations have gone from democracy to autocracy. Democracy to autocracy. Now, since this book was written, I believe every Latin American country now claims to be a democracy. And the dictatorships, at least on paper, do not exist. But during my lifetime, we'd wake up in the morning and some dictator had taken over Latin America. It happened in Honduras in the 1970s. It was a bloodless coup, but overnight a dictatorship took over Honduras. That's just one example. Latin America's population has grown. The large cities in Latin America now really grew. Now, folks, when I was a kid, they told us the 4 biggest cities in the world were New York, London, Berlin, and Tokyo. But then in the 1990s, the 4 biggest cities of the world were Mexico City, Buenos Aires, Sao Paulo, and Rio de Janeiro. Know anything about what all those cities have in common? The ones I just named, they're all Latin American. Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, Mexico City. The cities, the people in Latin America will go to the big cities, hoping to find work. They wind up living in slums. And I mean by slums, they get old pieces of tin from the junkyard and make a shed out of that and live in those. And if a big storm comes in, it blows them away. But there is no winter time in a lot of Latin American countries, so they can get away with some of that. Now, of course, you go far enough south in Latin America, you will run into some cold weather in southern Argentina and southern Brazil. It's not Brazil, pardon me, southern Argentina and southern Chile. Slums grew, and slums are a part of every Latin American city. The gap between rich and poor is still there. The rich are often very rich and the poor very poor. And with hardly anyone in between. Latin America became heavily involved in drug trade, and this is still, and anybody know, these Latin American countries would grow the drugs. Who was their biggest customer? Thank you. One of you know, the United States. The United States was Latin America's biggest customer, and one Latin America was, the president of Colombia said, if the American people were not taking so many drugs, we would not be producing them. He might have had a point, but the biggest customer is the United States. A lot of your poor people depended on the drug trade for survival. They've had a problem with communism. Communism has tried to take over, and did take over some of them, Cuba particularly. Now, when Castro took over Cuba in 1959, he sent guerrillas to Latin American nations, encouraging them to revolt. Castro's close friend, Che Guevara, was in charge of the idea of going from one Latin American country, encouraging revolution. Che Guevara got driven deeper and deeper into the jungle, and finally got shot dead by an army somewhere in the middle of South America. The United States from time to time has sent troops into the Latin American countries to help them resist communism. This was true in Guatemala and El Salvador. The United States would send troops in there to help them resist communism. All right. Taking the countries, a few of them one at a time. Cuba first. Cuba was ruled by Batista for a while, and then Batista would prove to be unpopular and corrupt, so the people replaced Batista with Castro. Fidel Castro took over Cuba in 1959, and immediately we found out he was communist. We didn't know that at first, but Castro was to last for, I guess more than 50 years, 55 or 60 years. He finally died of old age. His younger brother Raul took over. Raul was still ruler of Cuba. Castro took over all Cuban industries. The United States quit buying Cuban sugar, so the Soviet Union agreed to buy sugar from Cuba. Castro began moving closer and closer to Moscow and finally declared himself an out-and-out Marxist. I've already mentioned the Bay of Pigs fiasco, where the President Kennedy's promised to support an army of Cubans went in to take back over Cuba. President Kennedy did not give them support. The army was defeated, and to this day the people in Miami, the Cubans in Miami, hate President Kennedy. They have not gotten over that yet. In the meantime, the Soviet Union put missiles in Cuba, but we've used diplomatic means to get the missiles out of Cuba. Fidel Castro is deceased. His brother has taken over. One thing from what I know about Cuba. All right. If you go to any of these Latin American countries, you will see a lot of American cars that were made in the 1940s and 1950s. Mm-hmm. They hold them together by getting parts mostly from wherever they can get parts from. But they hold them together, and unlike in the United States, see, the problem we have with our cars lasting that long is we put salt on the roads in the wintertime, and the salt rusts the cars out in the bottom. But in Latin America, there is no winter, there is no snow. So they can keep these cars from rusting and keep them running for, as long as you can find an engine to put in them, you can keep them running. Now, for instance, let's say if you had a 57 Chevy in Cuba, it would no longer be a 57 Chevy by any reasonable standards, but it would have a different kind of motor in it. They've managed to fit it, hold it together, a different transmission than the original, but it would still look on the outside like a 57 Chevy. All right. Now, Chile. In Chile, for the one and only time in world history, a Marxist was elected president. His name was Allende, Salvador Allende. Salvador Allende was elected president of Chile. I believe the year was 1974. Allende immediately made overtures to China and to the Soviet Union. The Nixon administration cut off all aid to Chile. In other words, we have kept propped up a lot of these countries, but we stopped giving any kind of help to Chile, creating serious economic problems for Chile. The American CIA moved in, and folks, this is above the table history, and they supported labor strikes against the Chilean government. The result was a military coup in 1973. Basically, Allende only lasted about 2 or 3 years. Allende was killed along with thousands of his followers. The military to set up a dictatorship, and finally, in 1979, the military dictatorship was defeated in an election. The Christian Democrats took power, and as far as I know, they still have the power. But Chile was the only country that experimented with a popularly elected communistic government. The government did not last long. Nicaragua, the United States moved into Nicaragua and placed Somoza in power, and this will not be on the test. I'm going to write it down, but I'm going to mention it anyway. The United States put a dictator in charge of Nicaragua because they felt like democracy would not work among those people. But the communists moved in and removed Somoza and took over. So Reagan and Bush financed the rebels against the communists. Today, Nicaragua is part communist. It's got a coalition government. The Sandinistas are the strongest. The Sandinistas are communists. They're the strongest party in Nicaragua. Now, the big scandal of the Reagan administration was when Ronald Reagan gave aid to these countries that the United States had promised we would not give aid to. Ronald Reagan secretly gave aid to Nicaragua, the Contras in Guatemala and Nicaragua, as well as gave secret aid to Iran, our former enemy, but secretly gave aid to Iran to help Iran fight Iraq. All right, now, Argentina. Perón. All right, this one's interesting, folks. Perón became dictator in 1946. He married a woman who was extremely domineering, and together they ruled the country like a man and wife. She did not keep herself quiet. He began to use violence to intimidate his opponents. He went into exile in 1945. But here's something your book says. It was easy for the military to take over, but hard to rule. It's like sometimes it's easy for a man to become president, but hard to do a job when he becomes president. For the next 28 years, military and civilian governments went back and forth, back and forth. Finally, well, all right, folks, this is the part that gets a little bit ticklish. 30,000 Argentinians disappeared, along with 6,000 leftist communists. I mean, just people would wake up in the morning and find their neighbor was no longer there. Wake up a few mornings later and find another neighbor was gone. It created, because nobody knew where these people went. Now today we know where they went. They all went to their graves. They were gotten out of bed in the middle of the night, executed and buried. Gotten out of the bed in the middle of the night, executed and buried. 30,000 of them. This was what Argentina did to keep down opposition. A lot of them were leftists, that's true. But economic problems remained. Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands in 1982. Great Britain sent its navy down to take the Falkland Islands back from Argentina. The Falklands had long belonged to the Falkland Islands had long belonged to Great Britain. So Argentina lost. The military government was deposed shortly afterward. We hope that democracy will be the norm in Argentina. All right, now, folks, keep in mind, something that my teachers try to tell us, some of these countries simply seemingly cannot have a democracy. Democracy calls for people being self-restrained. If you're not self-restrained, then you have to have a dictatorship to control you. But, only certain people seemingly can have a democracy. Muslim countries generally don't. Yes?
What chapter are you lecturing from?
Right now, chapter 20, that's a good question. Chapter 28.
Okay, good.
Yeah. Oh, wait, here. Okay. Let me just pause here.